Hello, all. Come, and join me around my campfire. A place of fact, myth, and legend, of stories grand and small. We only have some time together, and I have many tales that I could tell. Battles won and battles lost. Heroes who rose and heroes who fell. Tales of the deepest love and the most powerful hate. But today, I hope you will allow me to tell a story that is close to my heart. It is a tale of a small man, a scholar with a passion for learning, whose greatest feat also tore him asunder until he was no longer recognizable, even to himself. His name is seldom remembered in the songs and tales that we bards tell, for who could believe that a skinny, weak husk of a man accomplished so very much? Indeed, if asked himself, he would likely brush off the memory of his great deeds with a wry smile and a shake of the head. But I cannot deny it any longer. He was a genius, a kind soul, and a man who deserves to be remembered. And so, I invite you to join me as I venture back in time to tell this story of gold, bones, and leather. Shouldering his immensely heavy, book-filled bag, Embrosk felt a sad smile flit across his face. He wondered whether he'd ever be back to the holy village of Bocere Mountain, now that he had finally earned access to the precious pages of knowledge that he would soon add to his once meager book collection. Embrosk adjusted the bag on his shoulder and took one more look around the small wooden hut that had been his home for so long. It was now empty. He took a deep breath and pushed aside the wool flap that served as his door. He ducked out the opening into the crisp mountain air, groaning under the weight of his bag. He smiled wryly to himself. This was not going to be an easy journey if he was already struggling with the weight of the more than 24 books and scrolls that he had acquired a week previously from the librarian and archivist of the village, known as the Werrig. He thought briefly about entering the Werrig's hut to let her know that he was finally on his way, but he decided against it. She already knew that he was planning to return to his home that week, and besides, she might be angry at having been awoken. He gave a sweeping look across the many wooden huts that comprised the village. It held a sort of beauty in his young eyes. Sure, it did not contain the towering walls and magnificent stone structures of some human cities, but in his 4 years of study, Embrosk had become happily accustomed to Bocere's elegant simplicity. After running through his mental checklist one last time, Embrosk determined that he had done everything that he needed to. He had said goodbye to his friends, he had delivered his potions to the Werrig, and he had gathered all his possessions. He had also consulted the maps on the best way to make the 500-mile trek from the northern Ogre villages to his quiet potions shop in the human country of Sandom. Just as he was turning towards the narrow but well-managed trail that would be his route down the mountain, he heard a voice behind him. "Oi, human," the voice said in the low growl that was characteristic of the ogre's speech. "Where are you off to?" Embrosk's face split into a smile when he turned to see who was speaking. "Finally headed home, Phelan," he said. Phelan simply grunted in response. He had been born into the more warlike ogre village of Nganga, and had never been quite as loquacious as many of his Bocerian peers. "I will miss this place, though," Embrosk said, looking into his friend's blue eyes. "And we'll miss you," Phelan simply responded. "So, what are you doing out here?" Embrosk asked conversationally as he shifted his pack from one shoulder to the other. He had already said his goodbye to Phelan a couple days previously, and most ogres avoided going out at night. Phelan shrugged his tightly muscled shoulders. "Something came up," he said. "The Werrig wanted me to go down the mountain, and I figured I'd keep you company on the way." Embrosk shifted his bag back to the first shoulder. "Sounds good to me." he said, gesturing in front of him to the long mountain path that Phelan had walked 1,000 times. Lead the way, he said. Embrosk trailed several steps behind Phelan as they began their long descent. Phelan was as graceful and sure-footed as always, reminding Embrosk of the large wild cats that inhabited the country of Inganga that he grew up in. Embrosk, however, found himself stumbling after Phelan as he acutely felt the weight of the books on his back. The path itself was quite beautiful, formed from the hardened crystal that lay several feet under the dirt of Bocere mountain. Reflecting off the white, shiny, crystalline steps, seemingly suspended in midair, were balls of everlasting fire, burning with a soft blue glow. The balls of fire acted as a guide for pilgrims, scholars, and refugees from other ogre villages. It had been those very balls of fire that had led Embrosk to the village of Bocere when he had first sought it out 4 long years ago. As they continued to climb down the crystalline steps, the forest around them became thicker and wilder. Crossing the official edge of the village, marked by 2 sets of parallel huts, Phelan and Embrosk passed, unspeaking, from the holy village of Bocere Mountain into an unsleeping wilderness. The noise of the forest was unceasing. The air was permeated by the hoots of owls, the chirps of crickets, and the cries of the deadly scoffin that lived atop the mountain. Embrosk shivered slightly as he heard the shriek of the great monster of the sky. The scoffin's cries made Embrosk quite thankful for Phelan's company. Phelan was quite small for his species, only 6 feet tall, and the horns that adorned his head were equally unexceptional in size. However, Phelan's physical strength and athleticism, honed on many hunting trips, made Embrosk feel far safer than he would have if he were hiking this trail alone. Human, Phelan addressed Embrosk as they continued to walk. May I ask you a question? Certainly, Embrosk replied. Why did you decide to leave at night? Phelan inquired. You are clearly scared of the Scoffin, and she does not frequently fly when the sun is up. If it does not offend you by my saying so, you seem rather unequipped for a nighttime journey. Embrosk shrugged. I used to spend a lot of time out at night in the village. It's the time when Bocere is at its most beautiful. I wanted that to be my last image of it. Phelan made a strange grunt in the back of his throat. The ogre's religious teachings warned against going out in the darkness, and while many of them, such as Phelan, often did, it was only when they truly believed that they had to. Nighttime is for sleeping, he stated simply. Embrosk shrugged again. I've always had trouble sleeping more than a couple hours a night. I always have too many thoughts racing through my head. Sometimes a walk is the only thing that can properly clear my brain. They lapsed back into silence and continued to walk, one foot in front of the other, down the mountain. The Scoffin's cries grew faint as the massive bird of prey soared through the air towards the northern face of the mountain. Phelan accompanied Embrosk through the night and the next day, until they arrived at a small cabin that stood at the mountain's halfway point. The cabin, made of trees that had been felled in the surrounding forest, was just off the trail, and had a warm orangey glow and the smell of a fire emanating from its open window. Someone must be there already, Phelan noted, as they approached the cabin quite weary. Embrosk nodded. Well, let's go in and ask if there's any room for us. I'm not terribly interested in doing more walking right now. He heaved open the sturdy oak door, grunting as he did so. The cabin was just as he remembered it from the time he had stayed there halfway through his first descent up Bocere Mountain 4 years prior. It had the same warm, lively flames dancing in the fireplace that sat along the cabin's back wall. It contained the same wooden bunk beds, leaning precariously against the 2 walls adjacent to the fireplace. Luckily for Embrosk and Phelan, the bunk bed reserved for descending travelers was vacant. In the top bunk of the bed reserved for ascending travelers lay a large ogre woman, the only other occupant of the cabin. She was dressed strangely, wearing both a tough leather shirt and, seemingly in contrast to that, a flowing skirt made of a grass that Embrosk did not recognize. Then he noticed something else that was strange. Laying on the ogre woman's chest was an ornate lyre. The strings had a magical golden gleam to them, and the body of the lyre was pure white, with strange carvings along the sides, which Embrosk could not quite make out from the position where he stood by the front door of the cabin. Phelan seemed to be unaware of, or at least uninterested in, the strange ogre woman that lay only several yards away. He simply nodded in satisfaction at the relative emptiness of the room, pulled his wool cloak tight around his body, and stretched himself out on the slat of wood that was the bottom bed. Embrosk dropped his pack on the ground at the foot of the bed and climbed up the frame to the top bunk. As he sat on the slat of wood that was his bed, Embrosk wondered about why the ogre woman was dressed in a way that was so out of line with normal custom. The ogres he knew generally wore simple clothing that matched the environment of the nation village they lived in. Bocereans, living on and around a forested mountain, generally wore animal skins. In Ganga, where Phelan had been born, had grass and sheep aplenty, so they gravitated towards woolen cloaks. The surviving ogres who lived in the war-decimated nation village of Cadman wore clothes woven from the reeds that grew in the marshes that sat to the west of their kingdom. Admittedly, Embrosk had only seen one ogre from Bocere, a nation village that was largely ostracized from other ogre communities, but he had been wearing a simple cloak when Embrosk had met him. Perhaps this woman had some sort of special designation in her nation village, Embrosk considered. Unlike human society, where clothing and class were strictly aligned, ogres generally dressed in all the same way, regardless of their standing in the community. However, Embrosk supposed that there were exceptions to every rule. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, and through the small window, Embrosk saw the sun begin to peek out from the horizon. Embrosk decided to read one of his newly acquired books to focus his wandering mind. Perhaps it would even lull him into the sleep that his body craved, but his mind would not allow. He climbed back down the frame of the bed and pulled a random book from his pack, before climbing back up to the bunk. The book he had chosen was an old one, written at least 1,000 years before. It was a set of 20 very thinly cut wooden boards, loosely sewn together to approximate the shape of a modern book. Each board had a row of 10 runic symbols burned into its face. Embrosk's well-trained eyes flitted over the symbols, deciphering each one based on his knowledge of ancient ogre dialects. Embrosk was quickly able to deduce that each board contained information on a different potion, with the front of the board describing the brewing of the potion and the back describing the antidote. Unsurprisingly, the recipes in this ancient book were relatively simple. Embrosk himself had already made all but 6 of them, albeit with slight variations. He read entirely through the recipes for the 6 potions he had not made and tried to commit them to memory. Once he had done so, he climbed back down the bed frame to place the book back into his bag. As he opened the bag, he stole one more glance at the strange ogre woman, only to discover something far stranger, that she was no longer there. It took a second for Embrosk to process what he was seeing, or rather, what he wasn't seeing. His gaze flitted between the bed and the door. What the hell? He muttered to himself out loud. He secured the book in the bag and stood up, sweeping his eyes across the interior of the small cabin. The fire danced playfully behind its grate, the light flickering off the walls. Embrosk's bag lay at the foot of the bed reserved for descending travelers. Phelan snored softly on his bunk, but other than that, the cabin was empty. The woman was nowhere to be seen. Where the blazes could she have gone? Embrosk had quietly observed her for hours that night, contemplating her strange clothing and the harp that rested on her chest. She had been as real as anyone in this world. But then, in a fleeting second, as he glanced away to return his book to its bag, she had vanished. A pit of fear dropped into Embrosk's stomach. There weren't many human scholars in Bocere these days, and many of them returned to their home kingdoms with no problem at all. But others had reported strange happenings on their return trip. Some had never come back. Embrosk was not superstitious, but he also didn't like things that he couldn't explain. Making an instant decision that he knew he could end up regretting, Embrosk woke Phelan by shaking his shoulder gently. "Phelan," he whispered harshly to the sleeping ogre. "Wake up!" "Yarg!" Phelan half yawned, half roared as his eyes sprang open and he flailed his arms in the air. Embrosk, accustomed to the ogre's less than friendly reaction to waking up, was prepared, springing backwards out of reach of Phelan's clawed hands. "Phelan," he said in what he hoped was a calming voice, "it's just me, Embrosk. I need to ask you about something." "Human," Phelan roared, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Why would you wake me up?" he demanded, apparently oblivious to Embrosk's already given answer to the question. "Because I need to ask you something," Embrosk repeated patiently. Phelan huffed. "What time is it?" "It's a little past sunrise," Embrosk answered. "And you decided to wake me up?" "Yes." "Because you wanted to ask me a question?" Phelan was doing a poor job keeping the irritability out of his voice. "That's correct," Embrosk said, hoping that his light tone would mollify his friend. Phelan huffed again, letting out a bit of an angry growl in the back of his throat. "Fine," he said with a glare. "Ask me a question." Embrosk took a deep breath. He knew he had the potential to sound very stupid here. "Last night, when we came in, did you see someone sleeping there?" he asked, gesturing to the bunk where the woman had been sleeping only minutes before. Phelan looked at his friend in disbelief, unwilling to believe that Embrosk had awoken him to ask such a question. "Why? Did you or didn't you?" Embrosk asked, cutting him off. "Yes," Phelan said after a pregnant pause and a small growl of irritation at the back of his throat. "There was someone else who was sleeping when we came in." Embrosk was relieved. At least he wasn't crazy. There had been a woman there. "It was an elvish man," Phelan continued, causing Embrosk's sigh of relief to catch in his throat. "An elvish man wearing a dark black cloak." There was a brief pause while Embrosk tried to process what Phelan had just said. How on earth was it possible? The question was prompted in equal parts by Embrosk's innate curiosity and the fear that was beginning to bubble in his stomach. Embrosk quickly flitted through his mental archive, filled with the hundreds of pages of ogre lore that he had memorized. Nothing came to mind. Embrosk was shaken from his thoughts by Phelan's low voice. "Why?" Embrosk looked up, confused and slightly agitated. "Sorry, why what?" "Why did you wonder? Why did you think it was worth it for me to wake up for the sake of answering this question?" "It's nothing," Embrosk said dismissively, diving back into the depths of his own mind to try and solve the mystery. "There was just something a little, well, never mind, don't worry about it," he trailed off. Phelan harumphed at this non-answer, but the politeness instilled in him by his ogre upbringing did not allow him to pry. Embrosk tried to swallow back the panic that was beginning to rise in his throat. His trip would be short and easy, he told himself. This was a simple bit of unexplained magic, and it didn't portend anything for his travels home. Changing the subject of conversation, while his mind still worked on the mystery of the woman's disappearance, Embrosk suggested that they eat their breakfast and then continue with their descent of the mountain. Phelan, his face drawn up in an expression of distaste and suspicion, reluctantly agreed. The narrow path down the second half of the mountain was not as steep as the knight's stairs, but was far wilder. The crystal stairs, lined with the ever-burning fire, gave way to a hard-packed dirt path, overrun with thicket and underbrush. The low-hanging trees closed in on the trail so tightly that Embrosk was frequently having to dodge out of the way of branches that leaned over the trail. While the night's walk had been one of companionship between Embrosk and Phelan, a kind of awkwardness hung in the air during the second half of their descent. As he walked, Embrosk continued to think about what had happened in the morning. He carefully combed through his memorized histories to find some sort of precedent, but still, nothing came to mind. When he contemplated the shapeshifters he knew about, none seemed to fit the situation. The disappearance made everything all the more complicated. It had magic behind it, that was sure. But what kind? A clever potion, perhaps? A magical artifact? Embrosk didn't know of anything quite so powerful. "So human," Phelan said as they stopped for a break around midday, sitting next to each other on a large fallen tree. "What is occupying your mind?" Embrosk jumped, having been shaken out of a daze of thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" Phelan asked again. Embrosk waited a long moment before answering his friend. It would be so easy to tell him the truth. He could explain the strangely dressed ogre woman that he had seen in place of Phelan's elf, and he could pose the question of her sudden disappearance. He could express his waning confidence in the journey home. Embrosk opened his mouth to answer the truth, but something made the words catch in his throat. "I'm just thinking about the long route home, and what I'm going to do when I get there," Embrosk lied with what he hoped was an easy smile. Phelan nodded, though his heavy dark eyebrows were knit in doubt. "What do you plan to do when you get there?" he asked. Embrosk sighed. In truth, the return to potion making in the mundane human world did not bring him much excitement. "You do not know?" Phelan inquired. Embrosk turned to face the ogre. "I do know," he responded. "I will return to my small potion shop. I will study what I was granted by the Werig, and I will use that knowledge to make potions." Phelan grunted. "And that is the whole plan?" he asked. Embrosk hesitated slightly. "That is the whole plan," he said. In reality, it was a partial lie, one that he had been telling his ogre friends for 4 long years atop Bocere Mountain. Never could the ogres know that he had traveled to the holy village on the orders of a human king. "You do not seem excited about your return," Phelan noted. Embrosk shrugged resignedly. "If I had my way about it, I would not return. I have no great love for my country or my people, but there is a promise I must keep." Embrosk sighed out loud. It was a promise he had made long ago, and one he felt an overwhelming duty, but no great desire to keep. After all, it was a promise made to a king. "Sometimes a boring life is a good one," the ogre rumbled. "Maybe you will grow to love that small potion shop." That was less than helpful at boosting Embrosk's spirits. There were adventures to be had, and great magical questions to be answered. Unbound by the promise, he could have pursued the mystery of the strange ogre woman and her shape-shifting. He could have traveled to the kingdom of the elves and the other ogre nation villages. Instead, all he had to look forward to was the small ramshackle potion shop on the edge of the swamp. "Well, I have several weeks of adventure left before I arrive back home," Embrosk said aloud, hoping that his voice didn't betray his newfound trepidation about the oncoming journey. "Maybe I ought not to rue the mundanity of human life quite yet." Phelan bared his rows of sharp teeth in a smile, as he chuckled slightly at the ruminations that were playing out over his small human friend's face. "The return journey will be no great adventure to someone with your intellect and skill. I don't know how much stock you put into the stories of the lost scholars, but if that's what weighs on your mind, I assure you that you will have nothing to fear so long as you stay on the paths. I have full confidence you will return to your potion shop within the next 3 weeks, so that you can rue the mundanity of human life. Who knows, I might even get the chance to pay you a visit." The night has passed quickly, and the moon is high in the sky, and so I must pause the telling of this tale. But fear not. When 7 days have passed, we may reunite here by the flickering light of the fire to continue Embrosk's story. In the meantime, spread the word that this is a place where stories are told. Tell your friends near and far that there is room for them around this hearth, so that we can continue this wondrous tale of gold, bones, and leather. This podcast would not be possible without the help of some very special people. First, I would like to encourage all of you guys to head to my website, bensbookshack.com, or my Instagram @bensbookshack to check out some of the wonderful accompanying artwork for this podcast. It really helps bring some of the scenes to life, and the artist who helped me with it is named Celeste Schiff, and I cannot thank her enough. If you want to check out any more of Celeste's work, her portfolio is linked in the show notes down below. I also need to say a massive thank you to Kira and Tasha, my 2 beta readers, who really helped me craft the story and turn it into something that I could be proud to share. I also need to give a big shout out to Madison Siwak, an amazingly talented author and editor, who helped me get my intro and my outro into shape for this podcast. If you want to check out any of Madison's stuff, her Instagram is linked in the show notes down below. Finally, I need to say a big thank you to my good friend Anais for her help creating character names and concepts so long ago when I first started this project. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Finally, my biggest thank you has to go out to all of you guys who are taking the time to listen to this podcast. I appreciate it so much, and I hope that you're enjoying yourself. And I hope to see you next week as we continue this tale of gold, bones, and leather. This podcast is brought to you by Ben's Bookshack. Everything that you heard on the podcast, including music, was written, recorded, and edited by me, Ben Kushner. For additional information, go to bensbookshack.com. I can be contacted at contact@bensbookshack.com.